Billionaire Amazon founder Jeff Bezos is also the owner of the Washington Post, perhaps the US's premier newspaper for investigative political journalism. Over its almost 150-year history, its journalism has won 76 Pulitzer Prizes. Most famously, it broke the Watergate scandal, leading to the downfall of former President Richard Nixon. But on Wednesday, Bezos decided to murder it, laying off hundreds of workers in what staff at the paper are calling an absolute bloodbath. About a third of the paper's newsroom is set to go, including entire international desks. This was from the Post's Cairo bureau chief. Laid off from the Washington Post, along with the entire roster of Middle East correspondents and our editors. Hard to understand the logic. But I am grateful for my incredible colleagues, whose grit and dedication to the reporting and each other I will miss dearly. The paper's Ukraine correspondent Lizzie Johnson wrote this from Kyiv. I was just laid off by the Washington Post in the middle of a war zone. I have no words. I'm devastated. In response to the slash-and-burn approach from the newspaper, its former editor Marty Baron wrote this. This ranks among the darkest days in the history of one of the world's greatest news organizations. The Washington Post's ambitions will be sharply diminished, its talented and brave staff will be further depleted, and the public will be denied the ground-level, fact-based reporting in our communities and around the world that is needed now more than ever. Of course, there were acute business problems that had to be addressed. No one can deny that. This is a period of head-spinning change in media consumption. The response to that is necessarily difficult and severely disruptive. Radical innovation is required. The Post's challenges, however, were made infinitely worse by ill-conceived decisions that came from the very top, from a gutless order to kill a presidential endorsement 11 days before the 2024 election, to a remake of the editorial page that now stands out only for its moral infirmity. Loyal readers, livid as they saw owner Jeff Bezos betraying the values he was supposed to uphold, fled the Post. In truth, they were driven away by the hundreds of thousands. Bezos' sickening efforts to curry favour with President Trump have left an especially ugly stain of their own. This is a case study in near-instant self-inflicted brand destruction. That decision to pull the paper's 2024 endorsement of Kamala Harris just days before the election, a decision handed down to its editorial team by Bezos, led 300,000 subscribers to flee the paper. But it wasn't Bezos' last bit of electoral interference. This is from the Financial Times. Bezos, who acquired the newspaper for $250 million in 2013, intervened in the newspaper's opinion section last February to focus more narrowly on two topics: personal liberties and free markets, leading to the departure of opinion editor David Shipley. When Bezos bought the Washington Post in 2013, some heralded the sale as a way to reinvigorate the paper. But by January 2025, Bezos, along with almost every other tech billionaire in the United States, had formed an all-too-cozy relationship with the Trump administration. Later that year, Ivanka Trump and her husband Jared Kushner were guests at Bezos' $50 million Venice wedding to Lauren Sanchez. And Bezos had also bankrolled the newly released Melania documentary/propaganda vehicle to the tune of $70 million, according to industry reports. The film has only made $7 million so far. Bernie Sanders summed up the situation like this. If Jeff Bezos could afford to spend $75 million on the Melania movie and $500 million for a yacht to sail off to his $55 million wedding to give his wife a $5 million ring, please don't tell me he needed to fire 1/3 of the Washington Post staff. Democracy dies in oligarchy. That's, of course, a play on the Washington Post's famous slogan, democracy dies in darkness. Dahlia, we often don't agree with the Washington Post's journalism, finding it all too cozy with power and uncritical of politicians, like much of the mainstream media. But does the involvement of a Trump-adjacent billionaire like Jeff Bezos in eviscerating it mean we should start to care?
I think it's a really good question, and I think it's something that this is the kind of question that I reckon with all the time. And the question is, is the era that we're looking at in not just American politics, but globally, is it unprecedented? Is it a radical break from the way things have always been? You can argue that the war in Iraq, the war in Vietnam, the Murdoch-owned press, all of these things are the precursor or the precedent that for example, ICE and the way that Trump is the kidnapping of Maduro in Venezuela, the purchasing and dismantling of the press by billionaires like Jeff Bezos. You could argue, what is really the substantive difference between these kind of pre-Trump, post-Trump America? And by talking about how horrifically unprecedented these things are we romanticizing an era of American politics, of US politics, that should not be romanticized? I think it's a really important question. I feel like every day I wake up on a different side of that argument, because ultimately, why would Jeff Bezos buy something like the Washington Post? He would buy and run something like the Washington Post for the same reason that billionaires or the super wealthy have always wanted to buy and own media, for the same reason that Rupert Murdoch or Roger Ailes has bought and owned media. Because, despite the fact that this is a loss-making industry, particularly now, it doesn't make profit. It's completely a bad business investment in an immediate sense. But the reason that as a billionaire you buy up media is because the return on investment is structural. You create a social and ideological context through which the various ways in which your business interests are going to have to come at the expense of the well-being financially, socially, psychologically of the majority of people. By buying up the press, you make sure that the narrative that can justify your right to do that is the public discourse, and that you buy off the possibility of these media institutions being populated by anyone that might question or challenge or be critical of that. So you're buying the public imagination and you're buying public discourse. And that's really important if you want to go on extracting and exploiting natural and human resources. So in a sense, it's like, okay, well, what's the difference between Jeff Bezos, one of the richest men on the planet, whose business models and whose, business practices are destroying our planet, are concentrating wealth in unimaginable ways away from the many and towards this one man. These are organically unpopular, destructive policies that, if they were subject to any kind of genuine public scrutiny, would fall apart. And so you stave off that criticism by buying up the venues of criticism. One of those is the Washington Post. It's also why Elon Musk bought Twitter. And it's why Twitter is not, Twitter was always a bit of a complicated place, but it was at some point a place where critical media was able to thrive and exist. And that is no longer the case. And so on the one hand, we can say, look, the wealthy have always bought and owned media for these purposes. But on the other hand, I do think that there is an unleashing of moral and political anarchy in the worst sense by, the Jeff Bezoses and the Donald Trumps, etc. of the world, that is a product not just of a failing social contract, but is also the product of the extent of the inequality. Inequality has always been part of the DNA of capitalism, but as we all read the same Oxfam report every year. The extent of that inequality, the extent of that disparity, when you hear sort of the percentage of global wealth owned by a tiny number of people, it has skewed things to such a degree that there is almost a tipping point where it feels like the very few levers of accountability that we once had, that didn't always work, that often failed, but nonetheless were there. The tipping point, the balance of power has tipped so aggressively that even those levers feel like they are becoming a distant memory. And so, yes, it is simply an acceleration of the dynamics that have always existed within capitalism, but it is an acceleration that has had a kind of qualitative impact that has made it more difficult than ever, but more urgent than ever to resist the kinds of political economy that exist under capitalism.
Yep, I don't think that democracy can survive an oligarchic class like we're seeing at the moment. Democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the very richest, that is the democracy of capitalist society. Now, one news outlet that will never be owned and then consummately ripped up by a billionaire is your very own Novara Media. But we can only do that thanks to your support at home. Go to novaramedia.com/support if you would like to help keep us going.